Hey guys, JM here again with another Pages from Sages, our series where we take a look at different just quotes or passages from books, fiction, nonfiction. Last one we did was an actual grammar textbook from the 19th century. This one is switching gears now back to a fiction book. This is from the book Silence by Shusaku Endo, and you may have seen the film by Martin Scorsese that came out just a couple of years ago, and it was phenomenal. The entire movie, 3 hour long, and no music in it. It was only the silent soundtracks of nature and dialogue, and it was very powerful. But Silence is the story. It's historical fiction, but it's based on the accounts of the martyrs from the Catholic Church in ancient Japan. And there were Christianity actually had a pretty decent presence in Japan during the period of the samurai, but because it was so linked with foreign trade and influence of the Spanish and the Portuguese, and it got turned from Christianity into Christendom, as has unfortunately happened in history many times. And so eventually the Japanese kicked out all Christians, all priests, all missionaries, all of anybody who was a Christian. And there was a severe persecution that broke out among Christians, like insanely demonic in terms of the evil that they would do to root out from the villages, from the peasants, any trace of Christianity. And it's look it up sometime, Google it, do some research on Christianity in Japan, and it's amazing. Japan is still one of the least Christianized countries in the world, but the Christians that are there are they've been through the fire, or at least their ancestors have. And Silence is a book that I love because it wrestles with the questions of persecution and martyrdom, and how unromantic it is. A lot of times in movies, or even in Christian history, or even in the history of any other religion, you think of martyrs from other religions that kill, die in service to their gods, and they think it's glorious and wonderful. Silence is a great book because it really forces us to look directly into the mouth of the beast, so to speak, when it comes to just horrible atrocities and what it's like to walk through those as a Christian. And if you haven't seen it, the story, it's basically two priests end up being sent to Japan to find out about a priest who, rumor got back, had apostatized, had actually denounced the faith, and was now working for the Japanese feudal lords to try to help arrest and identify Christians and root them out. And these young priests they're smuggled into Japan to try to find out what happened to it, because he was their mentor. He was the priest who had meant so much to them, and they just couldn't believe that he would ever apostatize rather than choose martyrdom. And so they end up, if you've seen the movie or if you read the book, they get to Japan, and they're taken in. They're actually hidden by a small village, because in the village there are Christians. There are Christians all throughout in the peasant class, and they're wanting priests and people to give them the confession and communion and all of the things. Remember, this is from a Catholic perspective. So they see the priest as a necessary intermediary between them and God, which, of course, as a Protestant, I don't think that's the case at all. But regardless, the role of a shepherd, of a pastor, of somebody spiritually caring for his flock is very strong throughout this book. And eventually, the peasants do really well at trying to hide them, but eventually they get turned in. The two priests get captured, and they are sent, and the whole story is basically, as it unfolds, as they go through their own struggle with, will they apostatize? And it's very moving, but there's a scene in it where, before they're captured, they're in hiding, two of the villagers have been captured and have been, basically, their punishment for being Christians and having to do with Christianity is they're tied to a stake in the beach. This is a fishing village, and they're tied to stakes in the beach at low tide, and then as the tide comes in, eventually that's how they die. And Endo has this description. This is a narrative account, but it's really powerful. He says, he's talking about the priest. He's writing from the perspective of the priest. So the priest is telling about what he heard as he's in hiding, hearing the moanings of these. They look dead, but the only way they know they're still alive is just the faint moaning from these martyrs that they'll hear. It says, the moaning sometimes ceased. Mokichi had not even the strength to encourage himself with a hymn like that of yesterday. Yet after an hour of silence, the voice was again brought to the ears of the people by the wind. Hearing this sound, like that of an animal, the peasants trembled and wept. In the afternoon, the tide gradually comes in. The black, cold color of the sea deepens. The stakes seem to sink into the water. The white, foaming waves swirling past the stakes break on the sand. A white bird skimming over the surface of the sea flies far, far away. And with this, all is over. They were martyred, but what a martyrdom. I had long read about martyrdom in the lives of the saints, how the souls of the martyrs had gone home to heaven, how they had been filled with glory in paradise, how the angels had blown trumpets. This was the splendid martyrdom I had often seen in my dreams. But the martyrdom of the Japanese Christians I now describe to you was no such glorious thing. What a miserable and painful business it was. The rain falls unceasingly on the sea, and the sea which killed them surges on uncannily, in silence. In the evening the officials again arrived on horseback. At their command the guards gathered damp pieces of wood, and removing the bodies of Mokichi and Ichizo from the stakes, began to burn them. This they did to prevent the Christians from bringing home the remains for veneration. When the bodies were reduced to ashes, they threw them into the sea. The flame they had kindled flared red and black in the breeze. The smoke flowed over the sandy beach while the people, without the slightest movement, vacantly watched its undulations. When all was over, heads hanging like cows, they shuffled back to their homes. Today, while writing this letter, I sometimes go out our hut to look down at the sea, the graves of these two Japanese peasants who believed our word. The sea only stretches out endlessly, melancholy and dark, while below the gray clouds there's not the shadow of an island. There's no change. But I know what you will say. Their death was not meaningless. It was a stone which in time will be the foundation of the church, and the Lord never gives us a trial which we cannot overcome. Mokichi and Ichizo are with the Lord. Like the numerous Japanese martyrs who have gone before, they now enjoy everlasting happiness. I also, of course, am convinced of all this. And yet, why does this feeling of grief remain in my heart? Why does the song of the exhausted Mokichi bound to the stake gnaw constantly at my heart? We're on our way. We're on our way. We're on our way to the temple of paradise. To the temple of paradise. To the great temple. I have heard from the people of Tomogi that many Christians, when dragged off to the place of execution, sang this hymn, a melody filled with dark sadness. Life in this world is too painful for these Japanese peasants. Only by relying on the temple of paradise have they been able to go on living. Such is the sadness which fills that song. What do I want to say? I myself do not quite understand. Only that today, when for the glory of God, Mokichi and Ichizo moaned, suffered, and died, I cannot bear the monotonous sound of the dark sea gnawing at the shore. Behind the depressing silence of this sea, the silence of God. The feeling that while men raise their voices in anguish, God remains, with folded arms, silent. This is such a powerful line. This could have come straight from some of the psalmists in Israel. When they looked around and they cried out, they saw the suffering, the evil, the horrors that we can't even comprehend. And they basically felt the same way. Why are you silent, God? You know, God, we read in Bible stories sometimes, like God's always doing this cool stuff. You know, he saved Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, right? He performed all these miracles, Moses, Noah. The problem is that the Bible spans thousands of years. And we're just getting the highlights. We're just getting the rare glimpses whenever the vast majority of the time God's people suffer, they do so not with any romanticism. I go every year or most years to India and do training, teaching, theological workshops, leadership, educational seminars there for pastors and in India, and some of them have actually experienced levels of persecution that would approach this. Some of them have told me about watching family members killed in front of them, about villages being burned down, churches being destroyed, wives and children, infants having to flee and literally live in the jungle for weeks at a time. There's nothing romantic about it. There's nothing beautiful from our perspective about it. And this book, I like this because Endo, he actually wrestles with that and has his character, a priest, wrestle with that and say, I know in my head that I know what's happening through the eyes of heaven is actually a glorious thing, precious in the eyes of the Lord, or the death of his children. God is there in a way that we can't see, that we can't hear, that we can't understand. And he says, I know this in my head. And I know that, yes, these deaths will be the foundation upon which others come. You know, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. I think Tertullian said that, and it's always been true. But that doesn't make it in the moment any less evil, any less heinous, any less just bafflingly meaningless seeming. And on top of that, the sense of God's silence. That's the word. I think more than anything else, the scariest thing when I think about facing, if I were to ever face, you know, real persecution, martyrdom, God forbid, but if that were to ever happen, the thing the scariest thing thinking about that would be if there was nothing but silence. And that's something that, again, it's not impious to think about this. It's not disrespectful to God to ask, hey, God, why are you silent while I watch my friend die of cancer? While I preach the funeral of somebody who lost their child for no reason, no cause at all, in the middle of the night in their crib? Why, when I've cried and screamed and begged and pleaded for you to take this chronic disease away from me that's destroying my body, why has there been silence? You know, these are I'm just thinking of situations of either me or people that I know, and that is a question that really does cut through all of the churchianity, all of the cliche bumper sticker Christianity, and bring us into what theologians throughout the centuries have dubbed the dark night of the soul. And it's something that I believe every true follower of Jesus, every true disciple, at some point will experience. Hopefully it's the exception rather than the norm, but it is something that when you come out the other side, when you've wrestled with God, when you've gone through a period of silence from the Lord and not hearing and not knowing and being just feeling forsaken, on the other side of it is resurrection and redemption and a deeper, more profound faith, the faith of Job, the faith of Paul, the faith of Peter, the faith of Jesus. You know, willing to go through, Lord, if there's any other way, let this not happen. But, nevertheless, your will be done. That's when we've truly embraced the sovereignty of God. But it doesn't mean we have to rejoice in it. It doesn't mean we have to tell other people, God forbid, when somebody's suffering, that we give a glib, cliche response to them. No, weep with those who weep, is what Scripture commands us. Sit in silence. Job's friends only screwed up when they opened their mouths. And sometimes that's what people who are really wrestling with God, with his silence, with the lack of, you know, joy, hope, any of those things in their life, whether it's because of depression, whether it's because of a death, whether it's because of an illness, whether it's because of persecution, sometimes God speaks the loudest in his silence. This book is, I strongly recommend it. It's not a typical Christian fiction happy ending book. It's real, it's raw, and that's why it's considered one of the literary masterpieces, actually, in history. So check it out, and I highly recommend it. Silence, Shusaku Endo. We'll see you next time.